Welcome to the Question Table. The Question Table is a podcast of the Way Home Ministries, and I am your host, Sylvia Geronimo, and I'm so glad you're here. I welcome you to the space where we don't rush to answers and where we slow down long enough to sit with the questions that shape our inner lives, that shape our faith, our attachments, our fears, and our hopes. Today's question is a sassy one, but it's also a searching one. And here it is. What are you looking at? I feel like I have to ask that question with an attitude. What are you looking at? Let me give you the setting for this question. I recently finished reading The Landscapes of the Soul by Cyd and Geoff Holsclaw. If you haven't read it yet, I really want to encourage you to get it and sit with it and let it read you a little bit. They do a beautiful job laying out the attachment theory and the false strategies we develop to survive in this world. Strategies that may have once protected us, but now quietly get in the way of experiencing the love of God. As I was reading, I found myself stopping mid-page and asking a question that felt both simple and unsettling. What am I looking at? Where are my eyes? What has my attention? What am I orientating my life around? And I realized this isn't just a passing thought, this is a question worth sitting with. So today I want to unpack it with you. You know, attention is a spiritual act. I'm asking this question because it's about attention, about what you're directing your gaze towards. What sits in your field of vision, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally? Because what we look at shapes how we live. The scripture gives us many examples of how Jesus meets us in our weakness. He meets us in those places of limitation, in those places of temptations, in our failures, and in our fragile places. And thank God for that. Because those are often the places where we feel most desperate for grace. But Scripture also shows us something else. Jesus meets us in our strengths. He affirms what we're good at. He can recognize our courage and our initiative, and He calls forth our intelligence, our creativity, and our leadership. He celebrates growth and fruitfulness. And yet, even there, He always invites us to go deeper. I would like us to look at affirmation and attachment. We all need to be affirmed, and we all long for validation. And isn't it interesting, if you ask people whose love language is words of affirmation, many of them will tell you, almost without exception, that this is the very thing they feel they don't receive enough of. But when we look at Scripture, we see God's affirming us again and again, like a good parent does. You are my beloved child, He says. You are the apple of my eye. I have given you gifts. I delight in you. God gives us agency. He empowers us for action, and He invites our participation. But He also knows that this affirmation and this sense of given independence and ability can quietly become substitutes for intimacy. So God is careful not to withhold affirmation, but to root it in relationship. Unless He does that, we get proud. We are empowered not apart from Him, but alongside Him. And we see such a good example of this in the story of Peter on the water. This is found in Matthew 14, 22 to 33. It is a long passage, so I'm not going to read it here, but I would encourage you to look it up and read it for yourself. But in the story, we see this beautiful example of Peter walking on the water. We read that after feeding the 5,000, Jesus tells His disciples to cross the lake in a boat without Him. He said He was going to stay behind to pray and He would meet them later. So later, in the middle of the night, Jesus comes towards them, but he's walking on the water. And the disciples are terrified. They think he's a ghost. And Jesus calls out, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." This is found in verse 27. And then Peter does something remarkable. He asks Jesus a question. "Lord, if it's you, if it is you." In other words, is it you? Really? "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And this is bold and it's risky. This is what secure attachment begins to look like. And so Peter doesn't withdraw. He doesn't stay frozen in fear. He moves towards Jesus, even if it means doing something that feels impossible. And Jesus says one word, "Come." You know, there is an interplay of courage, risk, and our secure attachment to God. This is the kind of crazy that faith and Jesus invites us into. It is not a reckless faith or a faith that is trying to prove something, but it's relational risk. Jesus invites Peter to put faith into practice and to integrate his courage and dependence, and to live out both his independence to choose and to choose intimacy with Jesus. And so we see here Peter as an example of someone who is learning how to trust and how to hope and how to love in real time. So Peter gets out of the boat, and for a moment, he walks on water. Let's not rush past that, because I think that this is humanity as God intended it. It is free and brave and hopeful and strong and safe. And safe not because the storm has stopped, but because Peter's eyes are fixed on Jesus. Because with God, anything is possible. And Peter is here with God. So again, I ask, what are you looking at? You know, there are moments that the eyes shift, because we know what happens next in the story. Peter's eyes shift, and suddenly he again notices the wind, and he sees the waves, and fear floods in. And when it does, he begins to sink. And this moment is so deeply human. This is why I love the story. Peter is suddenly at war with himself. On one side, his old survival strategies rise up. Pay attention to the threat, they say. Protect yourself, figure this out. And he starts looking at the circumstances, and they tell him to be afraid. Peter looks at himself, and he tells himself he's on his own. But there is another gaze in this story. The eyes of Jesus still stay fixed on Peter. And something in Peter remembers. It remembers enough to cry out, "Lord, save me." Peter knows Jesus meets him in weakness, and that's why he dares to walk on water in the first place. You see, we in ourselves have old scripts that are often at war with the new vision. When we, like Peter, keep our eyes on Jesus, we live out our deepest attachment to him. We can walk on the waters of our lives with Jesus, not fearlessly, but faithfully, because we keep our eyes on him. But when we look away, we default to old scripts of survival, scripts that say, my survival depends on me. I have to figure this out alone. Needing help is weakness, and I have to be strong. Sometimes we turn our eyes inward. We obsess over our performance and our fears and our inadequacy. It's really a form of self-love, if you think about it. We practice our own presence, not the presence of God. Other times, we fixate on the waves, the circumstances, the uncertainty, and the chaos. And sometimes we don't even get out of the boat because staying put feels safer than risking failure, because at least in the boat, we know the rules. But Jesus still asks, why do you doubt? What are you looking at? So friend, there is a deeper invitation here, because this question matters, not because Jesus is scolding us, but because he's inviting honesty. Jesus doesn't just want to give you new eyes, he wants to give you a new vision. He wants to give you something steady to rest your gaze upon. You know, Dallas Willard once wrote, the first and most basic thing we can and must do is to keep God before our minds. And that is not about effort, it's about orientation. So here is a closing reflection. Today, wherever you find yourself, whether it's in rough waters or calm seas, whether you're feeling brave or barely holding on, the question remains, what are you looking at? Because you can always lift your eyes. It's never too late. And who knows, with your eyes fixed on Jesus, you just might find yourself walking on water. This has been the Question Table. Thank you for pulling up a chair today. Until next time, stay curious, stay honest, and keep asking the questions that lead you home.